very much. I hope this is the right amount of sound coming through me, not too much. I'm really honored to have the chance to speak here, and I'm very grateful indeed to President Hall for inviting me. There is, I know, a long and a continuing history of American educational institutions in the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean. And the list that I have been able to put together, it starts with Tirana and Sofia, it comes through Pristina, to Thessaloniki, Athens, Istanbul, Beirut, and Cairo. And I hope I have not missed any. And I think I'm right when I say that all of these colleges and universities have played, and they continue to play, a key role, an important role in their countries and in their regions. I remember reading years ago that it was Bulgarian students from Robert College in Istanbul who helped to write the first Bulgarian constitution in 1879. So you can understand how pleased I am to see an American university here in Pristina. And I hope certainly that it will play as positive and important role here in decades to come as the other institutions that I mentioned. And what I've seen so far, you certainly made an excellent start. My subject today is failed states, and to some extent what lessons we can learn from the history of their failure. And I want to start by saying that the identification of a country as a failed state is necessarily a subjective decision. The best list that I know of failed states is one that is put out by something called the Fund for Peace, which is a private American organization. You can find its website online and their list. And I think that their ranking of all countries from failed to utterly successful is probably the best list that exists, although one of the countries that they list among those least likely to fail, and Belgium is, from what I know, quite possibly going to divide at some point into two. And two others, very low on the list, Iceland and Ireland, of course, have had very serious fiscal problems in recent times. The Fund's latest list is dated a year ago, 2010, and I'm sorry to say it still lumps Kosovo, together with Serbia, as number 86 on the list, which totals 177 countries, Somalia being number 1, and Norway being the last 177. Now, the Fund states that their criterion for listing a country or not is simply whether or not that country is a member state of the United Nations. So they don't list Palestine either, or for that matter, Taiwan. I myself think it's wrong for the Fund not to have a separate listing for Kosovo. That's their decision. So today I do want to offer you some suggestions as to why states fail. And I want to make clear that I'm not in any way implying that I'm making any sort of judgment about the Republic of Kosovo. I know Kosovo has serious problems. It would be, I would say, presumptuous of me at the least to offer you any sort of analysis just one day after I arrived here, just 12 hours after I arrived here for the first time in my life. But I do hope that my remarks will be of some use to you, and of course I'll be happy to take questions afterward. I would like to start my remarks with a little bit of personal history. I did spend 3 decades in the employ of the United States government as an officer of the American Foreign Service. And I worked for several other organizations after I left government, but that's all long behind me. I speak only for myself. Now, as an undergraduate and also as a graduate student, my main field of study was Russia. And I began my career as a young diplomat on the Soviet desk in the State Department in Washington. I served some time later in the American Embassy in Moscow, and still later I spent several years working in and on the then Soviet-dominated areas of Central and Eastern Europe. Well, it was after that, when I left government, I was working for a large corporation. I attended a conference in Washington that was addressed by a number of eminent speakers, and one of them was Professor Walter Laqueur. I knew his name from several works that he'd written on Soviet history. Now, this is the end of 1988 that I'm speaking of. Mikhail Gorbachev was the top Soviet leader, and he was facing very serious unrest in what was then the Soviet republics in the Baltic, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. And one or two people have gone so far as to speculate that one day we might even see the end of the Soviet Union. And I myself have begun to wonder whether that really could happen. So I raised my hand and I asked Professor Laqueur what he would say on the subject. And as I remember, he thought for a moment, he said, well, that's a good question. And he wouldn't attempt a prediction. He would just say that major countries seldom fail. And as far as I can remember, that satisfied me, at least for the moment. But it was only 3 years later, there was no more Soviet Union. It failed. It fell apart. So my point in telling you this is a simple one. To me, the future is unpredictable, and no country has a guaranteed future. And that includes my own country, that includes the United States. We have a relatively long history as an independent republic, 2¼ centuries and more. And so far, at least, we've always managed to resolve our major problems, including our own horrendous civil war that started just 150 years ago this spring, and that killed 600,000 young men, which is a great amount, great percentage of our American youth. But our history gives us no guarantee for the future. One American professor who holds the Nobel Prize in economics, Joseph Stiglitz, warned recently that as the trend, you can find this article online, that as the trend continues in the United States of an increased concentration of wealth in the hands of the super rich, why we begin to resemble one of those troubled and distant places, distant to Americans, like Tunisia and Egypt and Bahrain. So again, I would stress that the future is unpredictable, it's unknowable. I do think that America will continue to resolve its current problems as we've always been able to do in the past. But my main subject today is states that have already failed, beginning with Somalia, a country that I once knew fairly well, and I wanted to suggest in part what lessons we can take from failures. Again, as regards predictability, at the time that I left my post as the American ambassador to Somalia, which was in 1986, in fact it was exactly 25 years ago this month, why then nobody that I knew was predicting a civil war in Somalia. And the people, the knowledgeable people at the time were not only Americans and other foreign diplomats and experts, including a British professor named Ian Lewis, who was considered, I think he's still considered, the greatest expert on modern Somalia. But there were also a certain number of knowledgeable and well-meaning Somalis that I could speak with sometimes in a frank way, in spite of the country's police regime. Now, in 1986, Somalia, for 17 years, had been under a dictator named Mohammed Siad Barre. He had been the commander of the armed forces. He seized power in 1969, and he destroyed what had been a fairly well-functioning democratic republic since they gained independence in 1960. And as far as I know, for the first 9 years, this republic had functioned fairly well, in spite of a series of major, and I think growing problems. But what we experts, or maybe I should say we relatively knowledgeable people, thought in 1986 that an old Siad Barre, who had children and probably big bank deposits in both Europe and the United States, we thought that he was probably going to leave the scene before long. And what we thought was going to replace him was some sort of a more democratic system, which might depend in part on the police and the military. But the Somali National Police had been, until Siad Barre imprisoned the commander of the police, the National Police had been probably the best institution in the Somali Republic. And another positive fact for the future, we thought, was that the traditional Somali clan system was rather democratic. There were never any kings in Somalia. And in some ways, the Somali clan resembled one of the small cantons in Switzerland. All the men, all the adults could participate and vote in public assemblies. It was true that Somali women could not have a part in such meetings, but it's also true that Somali women played, and they do play, an important role outside as well as inside the home. And when I was in Mogadishu, for example, there were 2 women in government as vice ministers. And one of these 2 women had published in 1982 in London the first book to appear in any country that denounced the very cruel practice of female circumcision and infibulation. And the Somalis also benefited from the lack of ethnic and linguistic and religious divisions that plagued other countries in Africa and still plague them. To be sure, Somalia's national borders, as happened elsewhere in Africa, had not been drawn by the Somalis, had been drawn in the case of Somalia by the British and the Italians. But in Somalia's case, well, the borders left a lot of Somalis on the other side of the border in Djibouti and Ethiopia and Kenya. At least inside the country, almost everyone was ethnically, linguistically Somali and Sunni Muslim. So what went wrong in Somalia? Even now, it's 20 years since the Civil War began, not everyone will agree on why it happened. It won't stop me from giving my own answer. First of all, there was potential evil as well as good in the system of Somali clans. There were 5 big groups of clans, clan families, people called them, and they were often hostile to one another. Within the clan families, one clan might fight another, and even lower, at a lower level, a sub-clan might fight another one. It had a lot to do with territory. Until several decades ago, most Somalis were herders, and they ranged over long distances with camels and sheep and goats looking for good grassland. And although no clan held written title to a particular area, there were traditional homeland areas for the various clans. It wasn't too unlike the situation in North America, where Indian tribes had traditional homelands without fixed boundaries. Now in Somalia, there's never too much rain, and sometimes there are years of drought. It's probably been true for many centuries that when the rains failed in Somalia, one clan would fight another for the good grassland, and they would talk about years of 2 milkings and years of 2 spears. In years of good rains, there was such good grass that you could milk your animal sometimes twice a day. And in years of 2 spears, there was no grass at all, and the spears would come out and they would fight one another. Now, of course, what produced the failure of the Somali state was not disputes over grassland, but the failure did have a lot to do with disputes between clans. As the dictator continued in power, he increasingly favored his own clan. They were the ones who increasingly got the good jobs in government, and the positions in which they could not only govern but enrich themselves. Now, Somalia is very poor, but hundreds of millions of dollars of foreign aid were coming into the country every year. And despite the best efforts of us donor countries to monitor the flow of aid, a lot of it went into the pockets and the bank accounts of Somali officials. And the clans that were excluded from participation were jealous. And a number of their leaders were put in jail. And some of them went across the border, got support from the Mengistu regime in Ethiopia. But perhaps most important, Mohammed Siad Barre didn't leave the country as we thought he was going to do. He stayed. Maybe he wanted to leave, but after all, if he left, what was going to happen to the clansmen, the cronies that he left behind? It may be that they prevented him from leaving, until finally when the police force and the army was disintegrating and Mogadishu was in chaos, he took what was left of his armored cars and went south. But even then, he didn't leave the country. He went up the Juba River and he held out there for several months, helping to accentuate and prolong the civil war until finally he did go abroad and he died in Nigeria a decade ago. Now it was Mogadishu, which was the center of government, which became the center of the civil war. And the contest there was essentially between 2 sub-clans, the Hawiye family. The Hawiye were the main population in central Somalia. And they had been on the outs as regarded positions of power.